Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we have author, award winner, and current Assistant Superintendent of School Improvement at Glenwood Community School District in Iowa, Dr. Chad Lang. With 2 decades of experience as a teacher, administrator, and district leader, Dr. Lang has extensive expertise in curriculum development, grading reform, and professional learning communities at work. Under his leadership, Glenwood achieved National Model PLC at Work District status and received a National Blue Ribbon Award for West Elementary from the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Lang's recent co-authored book, A Parent's Guide to Grading and Reporting, Being Clear About What Matters, sets the stage for today's conversation, where we dive deep into family engagement, effective communication, and how this impacts grading reform. We discuss how to collaborate to create learning environments where students thrive, families are empowered, and growth is celebrated. Now to my conversation with Dr. Chad Lang. Chad, fantastic to have you on the show. I'm super stoked for today's conversation because it's a conversation I feel like is not front and center in enough of our grading reform that we're seeing take place all across North America. We're going to be talking a lot about grading reform, but also what it means to communicate with families. Thank you for prioritizing your time and joining us here today on the show.
Hey, I'm absolutely honored to do it. Excited. Appreciate the podcast, the invitation, and the conversation.
Well, to kickstart the conversation here today, Chad, why don't you just share a little bit about your background in education and the journey to where you got to today?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm in year 20 now in PK-12 education as a teacher, an administrator, or a central office personnel like I am now for a school district. And it's been a wonderful journey, unique challenges that have evolved over time, and of course, a perfect career choice for somebody who has learner at number one of their own attributes. And so I've really appreciated over time more of the attention to adult learning and a growth mindset and just all of that. It's been a great fit for me. So I started out as a high school social studies teacher in Iowa and made my way to Missouri in year 3 and taught high school social studies there. And of course, done some athletic coaching along the way and through a couple of different locations in Missouri. And then I became an assistant middle school principal and an athletic director for a school district in Missouri for 6 years, kind of a bedroom community to Kansas City, Missouri. And I've kind of come full circle. I'm an Iowa born and raised native in the United States and came back to Iowa 6 years ago to take a central office position at Glenwood Community School District, which is sort of a bedroom community to Omaha, Nebraska on the Iowa side. So I've been doing that. This is my 6th year. I'm now the Assistant Superintendent of School Improvement and a little bit of human resources thrown in there as well. And so that's sort of been my circuitous journey through the Midwest of the United States.
And Chad, I wanted to just double click on, as you mentioned, 20-year vet, but close to your heart being, as you identified, learner as a number one attribute to yourself. Mm-hmm. How did that kind of come to the forefront of your journey? Did you always know that that was an attribute you valued? Was it more through reflection that you kind of later in your career realized, wow, this is so rooted in me? Like, when did that come to fruition for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think formally, only really in the last half decade or decade of my career, and informally, I've known my whole life that I really enjoyed taking on and learning new things. Just as a student, so many teachers were great students in the sense that they just enjoyed the idea of taking on so much new learning, right, and expanding their minds. So that's not really unique to me in terms of my background. I enjoyed school for the most part as a student and relished the opportunity to learn every day. I was a little bit more intrinsically motivated maybe than the average student. I wasn't the best student in the whole entire school, but I had a passion for learning. And I think I started to figure that out as an undergraduate, as a social science education major at the University of Northern Iowa. They really encourage you to be diversified. So I was getting a minor in geography. I was getting a minor in history. I was getting a minor in political science at the same time, so that those could turn into teaching endorsements, quite frankly, but vastly different within the social science umbrella. And then, of course, the educational pedagogy was fascinating as well. And I guess really for me, accidentally, I ended up in a master's degree program at 27 years old in my third or fourth year teaching, and just absolutely loved the application of the learning to practice. So that was really different because everything up to that point was really theoretical, frankly. A little bit of your undergraduate experience you're putting to practice immediately if you have opportunity to be in front of students. But that master's degree program, I was a full-time teacher learning about school leadership and seeing it every day organically, a valuable learning experience. And then just having the opportunity in 2017 to join the doctoral program in educational leadership at the University of Missouri-Columbia. And what was fascinating about that is that was not a traditional superintendency type doctoral degree. It was in programming evaluation and policy analysis. So I was with clergy members, university higher ed folks, K-12 educators, really 100 individuals from all around the state of Missouri for 3 years. And that was just absolutely eye-opening, just to learn about school leadership in general or leadership in general and really diversify and broaden my scope. And I absolutely loved every minute of that process. And I never anticipated doing that. And that sort of stimulated a love or a passion for writing as well, which again was not in my background. But again, that exposure element is so important as you grow and learn, and I'm still growing and learning every day today. So that's sort of a broader journey of how I've come to know Learner. And then I've done the Gallup Strengths Profile, the Strengths Quest, or the Strengths Finder a number of times with our staff and our leadership team. And Learner has came out number one all 3 times. And so that makes perfect sense. So I've really embraced it, and it's easy to embrace when it's just sort of organically ingrained in your DNA, I think, as well.
Sure. I think it's an interesting call out as you're talking about exposure to these different opportunities and how that awoke new passions or area of interest for you. And it just really resonates with what we're hearing a lot from districts these days who are creating unique composite high schools or choice schools, really boosting their CTE or real world relevant experiences, because the literature is saying expose your students to opportunity and allow them to try it before they get into the real world, right? And just I make that connection. I see that kind of living proof of your own journey kind of in that area. But as you're going through this whole journey through as a former teacher into leadership, I'm curious when you started recognizing standards-based grading and really becoming aware of standards-based grading. And did you have an aha moment when you made that realization that, hey, this is a better way? And what did it look like to start exploring and bringing it to your practice?
Yeah, in 2007, I was in a school district that was really exploring the idea of grading reform on the back of great work by Rick Wormley and some others at that time. The school district was looking for teachers from each building in a district that would comprise a research team, for lack of better terms. And I was a high school social studies teacher at the time, and I was kind of asked or shoulder tapped to be on that team. And what was wonderful about the experience is it was easy for me to say yes. I knew nothing about grading reform at that point. I hadn't heard anything about standards-based grading or competency-based grading. It never entered my mind. If it had, it passed right in front of me. And so I was not aware of that, but I was a learner. So it was a great entry point because I'm like, sure, this sounds wonderful to learn, and put on a research team in the school district. So there was zero application whatsoever in change of practice. And I think this is so foundational that it's really formed me in helping and supporting other school districts trying to make that transformation today, is that take some time to go slow in order to go fast, or just never go fast. There isn't an inherent value in reforming quickly all the time. And so we spent an entire year at elementary teachers, middle school teachers, a high school teacher from every content area. And we dove into asking ourselves some really critical questions through the work of Bob Marzano and Rick Wormley and others, Tom Gusky, Susan Brookhart, and just asking ourselves some critical questions about the practices that we were doing in our schools and whether they were aligning to what we felt like best practice to communicate what a child could know or do in school. And we laid forward a program or a plan coming out of that 1 year of study to do some pilot implementation in year 2, which would have been 2008, 2009 school year. And then we went ahead and did that, just us. And we communicated with our colleagues all along the way and did some professional learning embedded with the rest of the staff. And then in year 3, we went to full implementation in the district. And so that was really a 3-year journey as a high school classroom teacher from 2007 to 2010 that just ignited a fire for me. I was able to spend so much more of my time communicating feedback about learning with my students and not getting caught up in the clerical calculation of grades and the electronic grade book. It actually became an encumbrance to having quality conversations about learning, which is what I was passionate about, and particularly teaching American government at the time.
I'm really curious, as you were talking about changing the time spent in the classroom, I imagine if you could think back to that moment, what was that doing to you from a job satisfaction perspective? Like, how did that make you feel as a teacher, shifting that practice and prioritizing on what you valued most as a teacher?
Yeah, I think in reflection, and I still see this today, and I work with teachers today, is that you are not representative of the clientele that you are serving in a way that about career aspirations and passion. So I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a teacher. I saw the value and the impact that it could have on a person's life, and that inspired me. And then secondarily, I loved social studies. I felt like it was very comprehensive. There was an entry point for some student interest that hardly any other content areas could say. There were just so many varied entry points for interest. Finance and economics, geography, political science, history, and just developed a passion for that. And I learned really early on that a lot of my frustration with my students came from they didn't learn or have the inspiration to learn what I was teaching or responsible for teaching at the pace in which I had to deliver it in order to get through the curriculum. And it was the reflection through that piloting process of learning. Part of this problem is you are not stopping to take a breath and really reflect upon the fact that they're not seeing this content with the passion and desire and the predisposition that you have. Tom Schimmer has posited this recently as teachers are sort of the 1%. He shared with me recently in a conversation asking me, how many people are in your school? And I said, well, we have like 600 students in our high school. And he's like, would it be fair to say you think that 1% of those students will ever be teachers? And I would say, sure, I think that's probably the case, unfortunately. And he said, so do you think that you have a grading system or a grading framework that reflects just those learners because it's created by your teachers and your teacher teams, or is it reflective of where all learners are? And that has been an outstanding question recently I've grappled with that sort of inspired that work. So going back to your original question, just being in the opportunity to see that I was really in a covering culture and not a learning culture was pretty eye-opening.
I want to double click on that question from Tom because I think there's a lot to unpack about it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious what some of the realizations or things you've been moving forward with as you've reflected on that question.
Yeah, I think student motivation would be one. A lot of traditional grading frameworks in schools are built upon the carrot and stick approach. Is sort of, you should do this because I told you to. And a lot of teachers were naturally pleasers. They wanted to do well in school. They wanted to please their teachers and their family and their parents. And everybody was happier in my life if I could just do what they asked. And sometimes, though, that wasn't always actually learning anything or very little in relation to what I was actually being exposed to in the classroom. I was just being communicated with through perhaps grades that reflected compliance and completion, which of course is important.
Right.
And when you looked at your success, and we have these rose-colored glasses as educators to say, well, I was successful that way, you ought to be as well. And of course, that's a uniqueness about our profession because everyone that teaches in a PK-12 type setting went to PK-12 education in some way, shape, or form. And so did their parents. And so, there's very few other professions where so many people have a lived experience and to provide their biased insight on what should be done, what should be communicated, what should be graded, what should be calculated, so on and so forth. Teachers are not excluded from that. And so just having those conversations, really examining what we value, and then changing our practices or making sure we're doing practices that match with that.
And I think, Chad, it's a super critical question that all leaders or teachers who are listening to this show could actually start asking themselves as soon as our conversation is done. Don't hit that pause button. Reflect after, take note of it, but ask yourself about your practice is how much of it is just a reflection of your experience as a teacher and how much of it is better modern pedagogy that's out there. And as a former teacher myself, I was so guilty of doing things the way that I was taught because that's what I thought was best. You know, you're a young 20-something teacher trying to carve your way, and it's often challenging to take the risk to do something brand new when you know that, hey, the other teacher across the hall who's been doing this for 20 years is doing it the same way. I think it's just such an important question for us to ask ourselves. And to kind of build, it was interesting how you tied in the family connection to that lived experience as well. And I know that we're going to kind of foreshadow and talk a lot about how we can help families better understand the grading reform that's taking place. But first, let's just use this moment to talk a bit about the standards-based grading reform that you've been a part of and how you've started seeing this grading practice change over time, and perhaps lay out a few of the key characteristics that'll build a foundation for the next section.
Yeah, so I've been a part of two completely different districts, two different reforms, two different states, and two different eras, for lack of a better term. So I've already alluded to the original pilot that I was a part of as a teacher, and that deployment of standards-based grading and that rendition of standards-based grading in that school district, and the lens of a teacher at that time, and of course, probably a lot more progressive than maybe it would be considered today for a lot of school districts. And then recently, when I say recently, 6 years ago now, joining a school district that was down the river, to be honest with you, of standards reference grading reform, actually implemented and made that transition in 2012. I joined the district in 2019, and here we are in 2024, now going on 11 or 12 years of standards reference grading implementation, so over a decade of implementation. And at a time in which the district just needed some revitalization and some re-energy around standards reference grading, I was fortunate enough to join the school district and in that school improvement role. And so that's been an ongoing critical portion of my job, is to have this conversation to facilitate new learning or beta learning, or what's been phenomenal that we've really had a realization of is our institutions, the employees of our school, for the most part, as a part of our institution, have so much institutional knowledge of grading reform because most of them were here in 2012 and went through a lot of training. I mean, Rick Wormley on site, Tammy Heffelbauer on site, and others, and many, many, many more workshops, some of which I've delivered on proficiency scales and grade book and so on and so forth, that we oftentimes lose track of two things that I've learned. One, even if you have a low turnover of staff from year to year, in 5 years, you may have a third of your employees that were not a part of that. And so they're learning all of this institutional knowledge secondhand, which has its pros and cons. And two, you're having that same experience with parents. We oftentimes forget the makeup of our family and parents and the amount of students that they have going through your system. If they stay in your system the entire time, how much things evolve and change under their nose, but they're just not really locked in. There's a lot for parents to pay attention to. And I know I have 2 7th graders. So I fully understand that as a parent. You know, there's forms to be turned in, there's fees to pay, there's pickup times, there's concert times, there's extensions, and they each are in 7 of their different class periods, and I'm tracking notifications and awareness that parents are supposed to be responsible for. So as things evolve in practice, which we're professionals evolving our practice, so there's some professional institutional knowledge. It's not just occasional passerby knowledge that would need to be explained. It's actually evolving over time, and there's iterations as well. So what we lose track of is that parents come through the system maybe with an older child or their first child, and they experience one iteration, and maybe there's a gap. Their other child's in elementary while they're high schoolers there. And so maybe there's a gap in their attention to grades, let's say. And by the time their next child comes around, there's been some iteration changes, but they weren't well communicated. And so now they are really confused.
Right.
When you've went through grading reform to try to be more clear, precise, and transparent about what a child can know or do, the parent's experience is actually quite the opposite. And so that's where we've got to really tighten the reins a little bit and have some consistency and clarity around some core grading values. So that's kind of been two things I've noticed.
Sure. And I'm really curious, as you were talking about the staff and whether you have a large staff turnover or a small staff turnover. Turnover does happen. Retirements happen. People shift careers or schools. The call it that sort of 5-year cycle could lead to a third, half, what the number doesn't matter. What I'm curious about is, as a leader, how have you eliminated the practice from just becoming stagnant and building in a cycle of constant reinvigoration and support, so that way there is no deep-rooted institutional knowledge. It's just knowledge as a teacher, whether you're old or new.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we've tried to do that I haven't done in a solitary way. I've been part of some really great teams, and I'm on some awesome teams now in our school district. Number one, we've got to be rock solid on recruiting and hiring. We have to make sure that people understand our core values around grading and assessment when they're thinking about coming on staff, and that they're believers, and that shares a commonality, that we're hiring a person that's already likely to be on brand, and that's not far on the continuum of their personal core beliefs. Because I don't want people to come be a part of teaching our students in an organization they don't feel comfortable that they can carry out those values. Right. We can all name companies and brands and stores and restaurants that we've been to that you know what you're going to get no matter where you go in the country or in North America. But you also can name places that you don't. And what is that experience like for the customer? And the students and parents are our customers. So we really work hard on making sure that people understand the espoused values and core values that we believe in grading and assessment. And we make sure that they're a good fit for us and they want to be, or that they have an appetite for a growth mindset. They're like, I've been really desiring to be part of an organization where we can be involved in some standards-based, or what we call modern or 21st century grading practices. That's one thing. Number two, you have to build out really what I call an MTSS pyramid for adults. How are you going to support your adults in your organization to constantly learn when you don't have the support system put in place, both varying in intensity in the support, but also in the variation of individuals? So for us, that it really means instructional coaching and the importance of coaching and support on contextual differences and nuances. Our band instructor compared to our algebra teacher, compared to our welding instructor, have very nuanced circumstances they need coaching through when it comes to grading and assessment. And that's where standard professional development just doesn't hit the mark when it comes to grading and reform. They say, well, that works for you, but I don't know how that would do that in biology, or I can't make sense of how I might do that in a culinary class. And that's where that coaching, that embedded coaching that is optional but supportive, that's timely and responsive, is super important. So we have some just dynamite instructional coaches that really serve as lead learners. We try to work as a team collectively across the district system to have coherence in how we coach around grading and assessment. And so that's really a second feature. So once we have them, we have the right employees that we feel like are of the mindset that want to be able to live and do this work. And secondly, we got to make sure that we really support them. And how I describe it to staff members as I'm bringing them on is, we're going to be doing a lot of high flying acts on the trapeze here. There's a lot going on. It's high pressure. It's high intensity. That, as you've known, if you've ever seen a circus act or anything like that, it has a net. We're just going to move that net way closer to you and support you. And we've got the people to do it. And so that's been really, really successful for us, and to continue to do that. And then I think the third thing is ongoing, Jordan. We're trying to be better at having core values around our grading and assessment processes that are simple and straightforward, that we can tie our actions to when we get a little off on a wandering road at a different building or a different content, that we can come back to those core values and examine that practice and say, does that really fit our philosophy about essential practice or homework? Does that really match? And oftentimes it's just wayward because maybe that person was new 2 years ago, or maybe their mentor just didn't really connect with them on grading assessment, and they're sort of taking on an iteration of their own. And of course, that has all kinds of downstream negative effects for their students and their parents.
Right. I just really enjoy hearing you speak about this model of support. That MTSS pyramid for adults, I think, is something that a lot of district leaders can walk away with and examine their district support systems, because you're just, at the end of the day, modeling best practice top down to what your teachers should be doing in their classroom, right? Being able to provide personalized instruction and assessment to each student. And now they're getting that very same opportunity. So you're really creating a system just built around that feedback that I think is a really easy way to just preach what you're trying to practice, right?
Yes.
Now, as we are thinking about all this grading reform, you've really highlighted to get the buy-in from the teachers and your staff and have those core values, which is an absolute critical. But then we do have, again, those families that are tied in, those families that have that lived experience. And I'm wanting to shift the conversation a little bit to the families. Now, Chad, you are an expert in this area. Your latest book, A Parent's Guide to Grading and Reporting, Being Clear About What Matters, aims to support families in understanding this grading reform. So talk to us a little bit about where the idea of this book and this publication came from.
Well, my co-author, Matt Townsley, and I have had a lot of great conversations on some other sort of research pieces we've done, and we're both parents, and we both have been involved in school improvement in a K-12 setting, and we're both Iowans. We just have a lot in common, and he's now at the higher education level at the University of Northern Iowa and does some great work there as well. And we've just sort of collaborated around some things. And as we've discussed some of the sticking points in grading reform, this idea of tell me a story. When you talk about stories of trials and tribulations for our teachers in our schools, parents come up frequently. And so we just sort of marinated on, well, what would get us over that hump? Where is the block? Where's the barrier for some schools? And how can we help? And do some research and some studying. We felt like we've got a lot of different grading and assessment knowledge, but we had to dig in and learn a little bit more about communicating with parents in the 21st century. And then we pulled it all together in a book that is intended for parents to make sense of grading reform, if it's happening in their district, or if they should encourage that it to happen in where their students go to school, or just in general, maybe grandparents. But it's also for school leaders and teachers to read. We meant to write it with both a research backing and support, but also a real practical approach. And so that's the genesis of the book. And we really enjoyed the process and stimulated a lot of great conversation. And this is a really difficult point for schools and districts to try to put grading reform in a place or a way that doesn't seem indicting, but also supportive to have communicate. I mean, bottom line is grading is a form of communication. And in a great irony of the world we live in, it seems like we have unlimited modes for communication, yet record low clarity for what we're talking about. And when we're talking about students' grades, these have massive implications potentially for the lives of our students. We should want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what these grades mean. So that's how that book came about.
And I'm curious, when you are working with your own staff or collaborating with other leaders who are coming to you because of, again, you've led and been a part of multiple different grading reforms in districts so far. How often is family hesitation or resistance coming up as a barrier to entry for schools wanting to move this direction?
All the time. I think it's consistently a part of every school's journey. There's very little left in the modern educational experience that shares its history with 200 plus years of tradition in the United States, but grading. School safety, technology, organization, content, curriculum. Most all of these things have evolved tremendously, and thankfully so. But in so many instances, there's one left untouched bastion of change, and that would be the tradition of letter grades, percentages, points, some of those things that just really are not rooted in great communication or clarity around what a student can know or do. And that's interesting. That's a paradigm you're going to have to take a time to shift. And because the premise of communicating to parents valid and reliable data is something that we all can agree upon. There's very rare the case that it's interesting that as sort of a side point here, Jordan, that no matter where I've been and no matter what conversation I'm in, it's rarely standards-based or standards reference grading in and of itself that's actually troublesome. if you sort of unpack that for them and say, well, what's your specific concern? And whatever that might be, it's never, and at least in my experience, and I rarely can say things like this, it's never been, I disagree with the premise that a child's grade should reflect what they can know or do of a given criteria or standard. That's not the premise that people are generally upset with. It's more the mechanics, logistics, and implementation practices that are confusing, unclear to their paradigm, which is their perspective, which is probably traditional of navigating the school experience. That is the sticking point. And so what we try to work with is our own folks at being great, clear communicators in a proactive way, and then also identify the benefits of the reform so that there's more clarity and transparency in what it is that in this course or this grade level that a child's expected to know or do, and what does proficient look like, and what does exceptional look like. And that's oftentimes what parents want to know as well is, well, how much are they doing what they should be compared to their peers, or are they better than their peers or below? What should I know? And we can still use criteria to give them that frame of reference without giving them a grade in reference to some other student, sort of that norm reference grading versus the criterion reference that we prefer today.
Change is so scary, and I feel like that's a big thing. Families, how am I going to understand? I think as well, there's so much in our communities that is providing some of that change is scary mentality. You have families that are coming in from all over the place. They have language barriers. They have socioeconomic barriers. They're not able to be as connected to the school. So I love the idea of the proactive transparency. Don't just flip the switch and expect them to run along. You got to coach them along the way. And the call out of defining what your levels of proficiency actually mean with firm examples is critical. Mm-hmm. Because if a family member is expecting their students to be getting, A+, and then all of a sudden you say, hey, your student is now proficient, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. You got to really define it. And I love that approach of being proactive prior to implementing, so that the families can ask those questions and engage in that dialogue. But to kind of build on some of those ideas, talk to us a bit about a few strategies. Now, I'm not going to ask you to give away the entire book for district leaders out there. Definitely use that content, but talk to us a bit about some of these strategies that districts can begin to leverage to communicate to their families.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. Here's a couple right off the top of my head. Number one, I would figure out a way to make your curriculum and learning targets or your standards or your expectations or your proficiencies or your competencies public, published, and clear for parents and students to be able to know and understand. Rick Stiggins always says, I think historically his quote was, students can hit any target that stands still long enough for them to see it. So we actually have to make sure that they can do that. But just publishing these massive anthologies of standards from your province or your state is not enough. Notification is not communication. You actually have to be able to put them out there in a position where we can talk about them and refer to them regularly. And that's a challenge in and of itself. But most parents, and there's some research that you could provide to support this, they don't even understand what standards are. So I think the first thing, we talk about this in our book, is we need to take parents a little bit on a history lesson of, why do we have standards at all? Because actually, at least while we're making this podcast, most of our parents, most of them probably went to school when there were no standards. Right. Or they just started to experience No Child Left Behind in the United States, or having some federal accountability around standards and measures. But even if they did go to school where there were standards, there was no accountability to them. It was just sort of a recommendation. And there was, just no lack of clarity or coherence across any geographic area. So that's not the experience that most of their children are going through. And so that level of accountability is different. And the standards need some unpacking. I mean, Larry Ainsworth has been doing this work for decades on helping teachers and school leaders with tools to unpack standards. Imagine how impossible that would feel for a parent to unpack even what you might consider to be a most straightforward standard, like cite evidence for your reason from the text. If I just sent that home in a newsletter, it said, hey, parents, we're working on citing evidence from a text to make meaning. You might want to talk to your child about that without seeing an example of what that actually means and what proficient might look like for a fourth grader. They're not going to be able to support that very well. And I think sometimes we make a lot of assumptions or implications that, once it gets to a certain level, the parents are not going to understand it. I don't even know why we would even bother doing that. But see, the failure in that is two things. One, you're making an assumption about people, which you shouldn't do. And two, that's not a good reason to not actually provide the clarity and transparency up front. And maybe the third point I would just add is teach them how to do that. And I think we kind of commit a little bit and submit to that self-fulfilling prophecy that you'll oftentimes hear parents say is, oh my gosh, I didn't even do that when I was in high school. They're talking about math, or they're talking about something that their third graders learning, and they'll lament in that and sort of be dismissive. I don't know how I could help them with that. But they don't have to help their child with the content or the procedure that they're learning, but they can support them in doing that if they know what the goal is. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of things, even with my seventh graders, that I'm not sure that I could teach them the same way that their teachers are teaching them now. But I could ask some really good questions. Right. Hey, show me in your work. I didn't see where you're proving it or justifying it. I don't see you explaining it. I just see you listing it. Those kinds of things around the cognitive demand. Parents can definitely do that. In fact, not knowing the content is actually an advantage because they can ask some clarifying questions. It's funny to watch students' faces. They're like, no, mom, that's not what that's about. And so it's good. It really gets them to think about the application of their learning. So we really encourage that. We talk about some examples of that in our book too, and we model those conversations. At the end of every chapter, we give parents some questions to ask teachers and questions to ask their child as well to stimulate conversations about learning.
It's a really important distinction. I have a niece who's just heading into first grade, and we were on Zoom last night and asking questions about her homework. And I thought to myself, mind you, it was French homework and I do not speak the language, but it was just really funny because my first instinct was to ask content questions, not learning questions. And I think it's just a really, really good call out that provide teachers resources to communicate to their families. This is how you can be asking learning questions, because that's going to just provide deeper learning in a different environment at home versus just the content questions. And I feel like, Chad, there's almost this stigma that's going on right now with the expectation of families because it's glorified on social media or on television where students are doing these complex learning problems, and you see it on TV all the time, blue collar father who can't teach the grade 5 math. And then there's that stigma around it of, how does that person feel? How does that family member feel when they can't teach to it? But you're talking about changing that script, right? And I think it's a really, really important distinction for us to remember as leaders when we're supporting these initiatives.
Well, the parents shouldn't feel bad about that at all. You can't apologize for what you don't know. And we are professional educators. And so you're entrusting us as professionals to grade level, developmentally appropriately teach these pretty rigorous standards typically to students. You shouldn't feel bad about that. And also, let's think back to that conversation about perspective and bias. It's not about your intelligence as an adult. It's that you weren't taught like that, most likely. A lot of rote memorization, recall, low-level DOK and understanding. That conceptualization oftentimes came as an adult, if it came at all, through application. And so, now I see how this comes together, whether it's a political science type issue or current event. Maybe it's a mathematical concept. Maybe it's writing or the type of communication you have to do in your workplace. We just try to explain with most of our standards that application and cognitive complexity is happening now because the content, as Flippin says, is mostly commoditized. If that adult really wanted to learn about polynomials and they were super excited about it, but felt bad that they have no idea what a polynomial is, they could go to Khan Academy or YouTube or anywhere, get that information instantly and actually learn it in a different way that maybe they could even apply as an adult. So they really ought not to feel bad about that and dismiss themselves from the equation. We all could be that way about a lot of other things that we could have to learn in our lives that just don't happen to be taught in a K-12 experience. So number one, getting back to your question, standards, and just having this idea of criteria and expectations and what cognitive complexity looks like is really important. That's one thing. Number two, trying to make grading reform visual, I think is important. You talked about language challenges, socioeconomic challenges. If we put visuals out in front of people, I typically refer to a great visual as a placemat at a dinner table. And when I was growing up, there were cafes and restaurants that would have the menu right on the paper placemat. And it was fascinating because the child could draw on it and circle what they wanted. The adults could order from it. And of course, the waiter or waitress could serve you from it quite easily. And we were all living from the same piece of visual information.
Sure.
Communication was fairly clear. You wouldn't have to ask, well, do you have a side dish of this, or could I get a side dish of that? It's all on the same place. And so for us, we've really been advocating the use of proficiency scales or learning progressions that are physically developed and deployed for both parents, students, and teachers, and they're the exact same document. And that gives us that common ground, not only to see what the learning criteria are, but at what level of progression should you expect to see if you want to meet your goals. And there's any number of ways that they can be developed. Our colleagues Ken O'Connor and Tom Schimmer and others have different ideas. But the fact of the matter is it's visual. And I think that's really important. And that brings me to my third point that I would suggest in grading reform when you want to bring parents and adults along is just honoring adult learning theory, which is, A, you have to have an outlet to understand that adults want to learn through their lived experience. They want you to honor their experience. And so you need to do that. And the way that I often do that, and my colleague Matt Townsley and I do, when we do workshops or presentations, is to take that visualization a step further and apply it to metaphors that adults experience in their life all the time. For example, most of the time in the last 10 years, when I've taken any car into a repair shop, they give me a visual diagram of the health of my car, the tires, all the different pieces of a inspection, the oil, the antifreeze levels, and oftentimes it's red, yellow, or green, or here's the life meter of that, and we'll use that. When I go to the dentist, and this debriefing of my X-ray is a visual. When I go to the doctor, a physician, now I get all of my report, what used to be in the chart, just for the doctor, actually appears in imaging in my app that I get. And I have all this technical professional data that's visualized, and the best professionals take that data, those visualizations, and they can communicate with you back and forth in a clear and consistent way. They're taking professional data, grades, and making them visual in a way that adults are like, oh, that's just like here. That's just like there. Soil samples, if you were building a new home and you had to interpret whether this was a good place to build a new home and it was stable foundation. They're visual. They're charts. They're graphs. They're levels. They're not percentages. They're not points. They're not an average of your blood pressure over the last 7 years to determine whether or not you need to go on a diet. And so we oftentimes will do that. That's sort of that third piece. So there's a couple of things. Talk about standards, be visual, and make some metaphors, some analogies that adults can connect to.
Building on that visual idea here, Chad, and thinking about technology's role in all of this. There's a lot of families that, because of technology, have information at their fingertips around their student in a lot of ways. And I'm really curious from your perspective, that fine balance of providing families with on-demand information about the progress of their student and what that does from a family's perspective to better engage the student and not just be that scoreboard watcher about how far ahead is that student, and are they doing better than their classmates? So what does that kind of look like as you're working with your group?
Well, that's a great challenge that exists, and it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, the access to accurate, valid, consistent data about my life, my child, and their data is helpful and valuable. And if we have technology and software that will allow us to do that, that's great. On the other hand, as I said with some of the adult analogies, all of that data at my fingertips is useless if I can't make heads or tails of it. And we lose track that computerized grade books, and Doug Reeves and Tom Guskey have talked about this now for 20 years, can actually give the appearance of objectivity, but are really just subjectivity, just in a more calculated way. Just because something gets calculated out to the 10th decimal doesn't make it any more accurate than my teacher observation. It gives this perception of accuracy because of its technicality, I guess you might say, and algorithm, which is a whole nother conversation. And so we need to do a great job as school districts explaining with snapshots, with parent universities, with literature, and what exactly they're going to see when it comes to professional data and what that means. And there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. If you go back to the reference that I just made about your medical charts, your diagnostic from your automotive checkup, a poor or below average professional in those fields will not go over your data at all and may give you incomplete data. It doesn't work. It doesn't come in on time. I can make no heads or tails of it. An average one will give it to you with some level of clarity, but there's a lot of questions unanswered. And a great professional has that ability to sit by you side by side, literally or figuratively, and say, let's walk through this. Let's talk about the highlights. What does this mean? What do these things mean together? I've noticed, looking at your car report, the inside of your front tires are wearing much quicker than your rear tires, and also your brake pads are wearing out twice as fast. I think you're taking some curves too fast. Let's talk about your driving habits. Well, think about if we did that with learning targets on it before we ever got to a grade card or a report card. Hey, I'm seeing some connection between your child's ability to write about fiction and read about fiction that I don't see in nonfiction. Let's talk about ways in which we can make that connection and maybe improve. Is a lot better than saying they got a 71 on fiction and a 62 on nonfiction. I mean, that tells us nothing. And so I try to make that connection for teachers too, is let's think about our communication. And the one last thing I'll say about the electronic gradebook is that, and I mentioned this earlier, it is a dangerous and seductive detour to just notify. And what we need is grades as communication, which means there's a back and forth. In the 5th chapter of our book, we talk about a communication triad. And that means communication goes every which direction of the triangle and includes the student. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the golden nugget right now that I'm aspiring to get our district to and others, is to make sure that the student can talk both directions. I understand what the communication of grades and feedback mean for my teacher, and I can communicate it to my parent and back and forth. 3 is a dangerous situation. So you have to be very clear that you're operating from the same set of learning criteria and grading expectations. Doesn't mean you like them. It doesn't mean it's your favorite way of doing things, but we're operating from the same parameters. And so getting students to be at the center of that's a key. We have a lot of school districts going through grading reform in this country and really in the world where the students are the most confused of all. Sure. And they should be the most online. They should barely be able to explain it very easily to their parents. Because if the parents can't understand what we're doing, then surely the students are going to struggle as well.
I'm wondering, as you were chatting about triangulation, it just made me start thinking about those teachers that are bringing some of these things into their classrooms for perhaps the first time, that are just saying, this is so much work, or this is more work. I already have a lot to do. I have a massive anthology of standards I got to hit. Mm-hmm. What do you say to those teachers?
Well, depending on how you're deploying your standards-based or standards reference grade or just grading reform in general, it will be more work at first. Everything we do that is new in our life generally is. There's that adoption sort of slagger that you have, but you have to sort of live through that and get through the other side. Just on the other side of that adversity that you're facing is a better way. And you have to commit to that and show that grit and resiliency that it's actually logistically potentially going to be more work for you. But your responsibility is greater than that, in that your responsibility is not to make sure you taught or covered those standards, but they actually learn them. And so as you provide more tight communication feedback, particularly around formative assessment, you're going to be ensuring that the foundational skills and concepts that you are responsible, that those students are supposed to be able to know and do, that they're actually doing. And you're going to feel a lot better that they are going to be leveraged for future learning that's going to come up in that course where you're going to catch up. I talk to my students oftentimes at the graduate level of sort of like a slingshot. It's going to feel really slow, like I'm losing traction on my colleagues because I have to provide all this feedback and my students aren't implementing it right away. But as the year progresses, it's going to come quick. And then your eyes are going to open and say, it's all paying off. They're coming together. They're finally utilizing feedback to make in-time adjustments. And I'm talking about the students as well. But you have to trust the process. And that's hard for us to do because it just seems like we have this overwhelming amount of responsibility of standards over our shoulders. And we do, but prioritizing and leveraging those high priority standards will parlay themselves into some of those others that you're worried about down the road.
And I think part of that idea of trusting the process is also having leadership that you're surrounded with to give you time and space to take a risk, fail, but fail forward. Mm-hmm. I think that's such an important need when you're working on this change, because you're going to have teachers try new things. And if they aren't feeling supported or have that ability to come and sit down in your office and say, I tried this week and this was a massive failure, that's okay. And I feel like teachers need a bit more of that to also help push that needle.
Right. And here's the great part about it. When it comes to grading reform, if you're erring on the ability to try to provide more feedback, more consistently, more targeted to where the error is, or even the enrichment needed, you're not harming a child.
Right.
You're making it better for them. It just didn't work as you anticipated. And so that's where that coaching and support can come in. And we have change all the time in school that we have to have patience and support for. Differentiated instruction, technology incorporation, maybe a new behavior management style or a framework you're trying to implement. That, of course, is going to take time. It's a system. But being more clear and starting small is important. And we haven't talked about some of those moves, but I think there's a lot of great suggestions out there. Ken O'Connor's work, of course, on 15 fixes for broken grades is a wonderful place to start. Pick one, pick two, saying, what's low-hanging fruit? What are we closest to being good at already? And build some confidence in best practice. And you're building relationships when you're clear and, what's Brene Brown say? Clarity is kindness. You're building relationships. And so then you can have the type of feedback that's going to make a difference on student learning. Students, developmentally, they're at all kinds of different places, and you have to laugh out loud sometimes with some of the things that they say and do. But at the same time, they're intuitive of understanding that, you really value and want them to do well. And that'll show up in the amount of feedback you give them versus taking off points or, coming up with some sort of convoluted metric that doesn't mean anything to them. And I think the research is really clear on feedback out there from Dylan William and others.
And for teachers, having the opportunity to have vehicles in place to deliver that feedback in a way that's meaningful to the student. And it just goes all the way back to that idea of personalization, allowing the student to express their learning in a way that's personalized to them, but then delivering feedback in a manner that's also going to be personalized and resonates with that student. Mm-hmm. Red ink on a page doesn't work for everybody. It might work for some, but that's where that relationship comes in. You need the relationship to get to that level.
Yeah, and this would be a great time for us to talk about that never means lowering the bar of expectations. And I think sometimes that gets sort of thrown in there in these debates about grading reform, is that for some reason there's this notion or myth, I think Tom and Natalie talk about this on their newest podcast, is this myth that you're somehow lowering the bar. It's quite the contrary, actually. Holding students to, or what Ken Williams calls the crown. Start with the crown, not the kid. Let's not make excuses based off demographics or other things that we want to say, and say we're valuing the standard as the level of expectation and nothing less. And that's our responsibility. That's been really passionate for a lot of the teachers I've worked with, and really framing that understanding and driving a lot of the feedback measures that you're utilizing in the classroom. And I've appreciated that perspective.
As you're talking about kind of the keeping that expectation high and challenging and pushing students, it makes me start kind of thinking about durable skills and competencies and where this all comes into the mix. How do you see this grading reform supporting communication regarding those competencies or the development of those competencies?
I think it's an essential component. Obviously, most traditional grading includes some sort of grading or hodgepodge or kitchen sink vernacular where it's all thrown into an omnibus grade. And the danger of doing that is actually for people that say that should be in there, meeting deadlines, showing up, being on time, that should be in their grade. I agree. As long as it's separated out and communicated to the actual deficiency or proficiency they have, no different than anything else. I do think all of those things are important. Of course, they're necessary to be successful in a 21st century environment, just like they were most all the other centuries. But the problem is you're actually doing a disservice to the child by including them into the grade because you cannot intervene on something you can't name or identify. Being at 81% on the mitosis unit tells me nothing about your ability to meet deadlines. It tells me nothing about your ability to actually communicate your success or proficiency around the mitosis learning targets.
Right.
And so we should neither side, nor traditional grading or grading reformists should say that, oh, that gives us more information to make those issues better. We can't grade our way out of a problem. We have to teach our way out of it. And so what comes along with separating behavior expectations or 21st century skills or durability skills or employability skills, what comes along with it is the expectation and the responsibility to also teach those skills and to figure out, and this is our challenge for our district the next couple of years, we're really working on a district-wide verticality design of learning progressions around those core values that we believe in, that we think will prepare all students of all walks of life, no matter what they do, to be successful when they walk across our stage, not only in academic content, right, procedures and skills, but also in those skills and building a progression that would support them. And what I'm passionate about is then how do we take those priority standards, skills, or durable skills, as you mentioned, and then contextualize them to my algebra class, to my welding class. So if you use one like problem solving, I see all the time, or critical thinking, it's going to be necessary for the algebra teacher to call out and then directly teach problem solving or critical thinking in the context of algebra, sure, in the context of vocal music, in the context of welding, in the context of biology, in the context of sixth grade social studies, and not just grade your way out of it. You didn't have it, you didn't do it. We cannot come in with any assumptions that students have these skills, but building a vertical system would be one way to build off upon foundational skills and take to a more advanced in those areas and account for them. So that's something we're excited about.
As you're chatting about this vertical progression, it just makes me really start to think, and we won't have time to dive into it today, so we're gonna have to get you back on the show, Chad, to really break this down. But it just makes me start thinking how we just need to scrap what a report card looks like and come up with a brand new model of that from a communication lens and how that is going to be tracked. And maybe that's something we could circle back on in a future episode and start really breaking down and brainstorming what that would look like. So for the listeners, put it in the comments here so we can get your ideas and we'll talk about it. But just as we are wrapping up, Chad, talk to us here. How do you see standards-based grading and this grading reform just becoming critical to the future of K-12 education?
Well, it's a slow process, but there's a lot of great work going on throughout the world. And I'm encouraged by it. I'm encouraged because I'm seeing some evolution in higher education. I am seeing some technological advancement where there's opportunities to use AI to provide quicker feedback and for students to self-assess themselves, which I think is super important, and normalize the feedback back and forth around a learning target. Small adjustments can lead to some big results, and there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that vendors that provide online grading software are starting to be more cognizant of the demands and desires to be more clear around standards and targets, and that's encouraging. Again, I mentioned higher ed programs. I happen to teach in a couple of programs that have grading and assessment embedded into their College of Education requirements, and I'm really excited about that. I've seen examples of competency-based or standards-based grading at the collegiate level in undergraduate education and graduate education in the United States. I'm excited about that. And I think really, I was wondering if this question was going to come up, Jordan, and I think what I'm wondering about, and I'm positive on this, is this idea that we're going to get to a place where organizations, I won't say school districts alone, but organizations, higher education and whatnot, will be able to demonstrate the ROI of more clear and consistent grading and communication of their employees, their students, and say, hey, look, we're not implying causality here or correlation, but there's a connection that happens to be that our employees, our students, they come out of our organization, they come out of our system with a better clarity and understanding of what they're good at and what they're not good at. And wherever they go, appreciates that. And that's my vision. That's my hope, is that's where we go. I see successful examples around the country and the world. You think of the Navy SEALs, you think of the military, you think of patches and the Cub Scouts. So there's all kinds of areas where symbols represent competency. And isn't that what we all value? Isn't that what we want? And we can also expect, if you think about the amount of variety of standards that we have in a K-12 experience, that you would have a badge or a competency or this visual symbol of mastery or proficiency even when you walk across a stage of graduation, for example. Now, there may be some level of awareness of learning, but that is perhaps so altruistic that it's not realistic. And we can do a lot of great things, and we've done a lot of great things in this world with people that have shown tremendous amount of capacity of mastery in just some areas of learning, and some who have been generalists and have been phenomenal contributors to our society as generalists. And I wrestle with that as well. But I do think that idea of ROI, tell me about your most successful employees. Tell me about your most successful military cadets. Tell me about your most successful construction workers. Tell me about your most successful highway maintenance employees. What competencies do they have when they came into the position or the role, and what have they grown in since they've been there? And how did you know that? And I would be willing to bet most of it comes through application. I can see it. I know it when I see it. And so therefore, I'm excited about systems that produce information and data about what students can know or do in a K-12 setting.
I think it builds even further, because not only do they know what they can do, where their gaps are, but by going through this system, they also can really take feedback, and this is key, not personally and become offended by it. They can use it and grow. So they're coming in and saying, I'm good at this, I'm not good at this, but this is how I'm going to get good if you can support me to get there and give me the feedback that I need. And within 6 months, I'm going to be the best at that. And then I'm going to identify the next area that I'm going to grow into. I think that is a really powerful piece to equip your students with.
Agreed.
Well, with all that said, Chad, thank you so much for being on the show. We definitely appreciate the insights. We're going to have to get you back on. We're going to have to break down the next stages of what the report is going to look like, but can't thank you enough for the time here today.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. It was an awesome conversation, and keep up the great work that you're doing. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. That was author, innovator, and education leader, Dr. Chad Lang. Thanks for listening to the show, and make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. Interested in learning more? Leave a comment or email us at jordan.lewis@spacesedu.com, and we'll be in touch. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.